Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of History by Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Tony Burke, and we're going to be discussing his work on the New Testament Apocrypha. For those that are unfamiliar with him, Professor Burke is a graduate of Wilfrid Laurier University with a Bachelor's of Arts and Master's of Arts at the University of Toronto with a PhD. While writing a master's paper on magic and miracle, he became interested in a little-known non-canonical gospel called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which features stories of Jesus when he was a child. He pursued that interest into his doctoral work. His thesis, The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the text, its origins and its transmission, included a new critical edition of the text drawing upon a range of published and unpublished manuscripts. The thesis was later published in 2010 in the series Corpus Christianorum series Apocryphorum. Tony continues to work on non-canonical Christian texts or Christian Apocrypha, and he has worked on a handbook of Christian Apocrypha, an edition of the history of the 30 silver pieces, the amount given to Judas to betray Jesus, an edition of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas in Syriac, and a study on curses and curse stories in the biblical world. Information on these projects can be obtained from a look at his website and apocryphal blog, Apocriphicity blog, which I will have linked in the description below, including his link to the Amazon page, and go purchase his books as well on other websites where you can do the same thing there. So welcome to the show, Professor Burke.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you here. All right, let's start off with this. Does the New Testament Apocrypha contain any valuable information about Jesus and John the Baptist that is historically reliable?
I tend to be a bit skeptical in general that even the New Testament has much in the way of historical information about the characters who are featured in it. What the New Testament says about John the Baptist is clearly through Christian eyes, through later first century Christian eyes, and not necessarily what John the Baptist actually believed and did, or his followers believed about him. So everything we have is mediated through a Christian lens in some way. When it comes to apocryphal texts, the earliest apocryphal text we have that talks about John the Baptist, as well as we can date these things anyway, is the Infancy Gospel of James. And that text is mostly about the conception and birth of Mary, and then followed by the conception and birth of Jesus. The very last episode is the story of John the Baptist. And it follows that, I guess readers or people of the time were thinking, how did John the Baptist escape the slaughter of the children ordered by Herod the Great? So it has this story in which the soldiers of Herod come to Zacchaeus, the high priest and father of John, and they're seeking his son, and John and his mother have escaped. And so the soldiers of Herod kill Zacchaeus, and then we cut to Elizabeth and John in the wilderness, and they come upon a mountain, and Elizabeth asks God for help, and the mountain opens up, and John and Elizabeth go into the mountain. There they remain, presumably until John is an adult. Now, we have other texts, and some of these are covered in the latest volume of the More New Testament Apocrypha series. Two texts that I helped, that I edited, basically, that are sequels to that story, which I think is interesting. That whoever created this stories think of the Infancy Gospel of James as kind of canonical or semi-canonical. It's an authority anyway. But these are Byzantine texts. These are late texts, 5th, 6th century, who knows. But they take that story and they expand on it in some interesting ways. In one way, Elizabeth and John are still in that mountain and being fed by an angel. And 4 archangels come in the night with the Savior, with Jesus. Not sure what form he's in, whether he's a child, because he would be at this age, or he's some kind of ghostly kind of a figure. And they bring John and his mother to Jerusalem they come to the temple. They reanimate the corpse of Zacchaeus, who's hidden in the temple somewhere, and Jesus baptizes him. So it's a way of getting Zacchaeus baptized, despite the fact that he died before Jesus came along. So he's a Christian in his death, right? And then John goes back with Elizabeth, And then the text continues on. Eventually, when John dies, he gets brought to the temple also by an angel, where he is laid to rest with Zacchaeus. Now, that text was written to give some reading for monks, principally monks, on the feast day of John the Baptist. So there's lots of these manuscripts which have these long stories, apocryphal texts, for various feast days for certain characters. So it's an orthodox text, but it's not canonical. It's not an authority, but it's good enough for feast days. And the only other thing that really connects with John in Apocrypha, besides minor sayings here and there, are texts that are written by and transmitted by Mandaeans. And those texts are particularly interesting because of how they portray John and how they portray Jesus. And so this is a baptismal sect, baptismal group in Iran and Iraq. And they seem to have some connection to the first century, at least from their text they do. They started out as some kind of a Jewish baptismal sect who, according to their text, they fled Palestine in the first century. So it's possible, if that story is correct, that their ideas go back to the first century, maybe a John the Baptist group. And of course, they champion John over Jesus. Jesus is some kind of a magician, a lying prophet and magician, whereas John the Baptist is a true teacher for this group. Now, there's debate about whether or not the story of the Mandaean stories of their origin are historical or not. We know that the group was around before Muhammad's day or in Muhammad's day, but we don't really know how far back they go. So it's debatable about whether they are truly have these stories that connect them to John the Baptist, to connect them to the first century Palestine, or whether those ideas came into the group at a later time. But that's the basic text, the main text about John the Baptist that we find in the Apocrypha.
Does it seem to you that the New Testament Apocrypha, a lot of it was written with the primary goal of trying to expand on certain narratives within the New Testament that they thought was lacking, that needed more information to satisfy the story, to satisfy the readers?
To some extent, yeah. I think we need to be. There's a few things kind of unpack in that statement. First off, there was no New Testament when many of these texts were being composed, but some of the texts that became part of the New Testament were gaining in authority. So if an apocryphal text is written, say, in the late 2nd century, at that point, the Gospels have achieved a certain authority. So certainly they are in the minds of the Apocrypha writers, and Paul's letters for the most part have. But most of the rest of the New Testament is still kind of up for debate about what should be in and what should be out. So I would say, yes, that to some extent the apocryphal writers of apocryphal texts are working within the thought world, you might say, of the Gospels and within Paul, but not the New Testament on the whole. And they do fill in gaps. Like you mentioned the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and I mentioned the Infancy Gospel of James. They certainly fill in gaps, right? We get the backstory of Mary. We get Jesus as a child between the ages of 5 to 12, filling in within the spaces of Matthew and Luke. Some texts, though, will kind of react to them in some ways. So you have some texts, like, say, the Gospel of Judas, that presents Jesus in quite a different light than you find in the New Testament Gospels, and particularly portray the apostles in a very different light. In the Gospel of Judas, the apostles are villains. And Judas is kind of a figure who's kind of on the fringe of that. He's still a bit of a villain, but he's revealed to him some special knowledge that nobody else is privy to. So certainly there is some filling in. There's sometimes some challenging, sometimes some rewriting of the texts. So it's a mixture, and it's because of certainly some texts have an authority. But still, there's still a sense that one can play around and invent new texts and supplement as well as transform at the same time.
Does the Acts of Timothy, when it speaks of John the theologian organizing and naming the 4 Gospels, provide insight into a canon that predates Marcion's canon, or is it just late Christian fantasy?
The Acts of Timothy, this was a text we included in the first volume of the More New Testament Apocrypha series. Sorry, I'm always going to try to plug the series when I can. So we have lots of apocryphal acts which deal with individual apostles who get their own story. The New Testament book of Acts is kind of the apostles on the whole, though a large chunk of it deals with Paul. So every apostle ends up with an apocryphal Acts, and some of the disciples too. So Timothy's not really an apostle; he's a disciple of Paul, and then various other characters. So in the Acts of Timothy, we get a story about Timothy interacting with some people in Ephesus, challenging a festival there. And then we get a story in the text in which John comes to Ephesus after being exiled for a while, comes to Ephesus. And there, all of the stories that the apostles are aware of, we're presuming here, we're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're kind of loosely kind of put together here. And what John does is he arranges them into the Gospels that we have in the New Testament. And that is certainly a somewhat different from what we find not in the New Testament, because we don't have any account really of how these texts were created. But we have writers like Eusebius who talk about the order the Gospels were written and so forth. So this is a slightly different take on it, this sense that John is the one organizing them. But the same basic idea is there that we find in tradition, that the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were earlier, and then John comes along and presents kind of theological expansion of the stories, or a theological take, talking about things that the other writers did not. So we have a similar kind of thing going on there, but just this idea that John is arranging them all is something new. So the text, it shows signs of being written somewhere around the late 4th, early 5th century. So it's certainly late. And it doesn't really relate to Marcion so much, because Marcion's canon was only one gospel, which is the Gospel of Luke, and 10 of Paul's letters. So not the pastoral epistles and not the epistle to the Hebrews. So he had a twofold gospel of a gospel and epistles of Paul, which shows you that he held Paul in a certain high esteem. But he wanted one gospel only, and there's debate about why that is. But what's interesting about Marcion is he is the first one to really come up with a canon of Christian-only texts, because he saw the Hebrew Bible God, the God of the Old Testament, as it's coined by Christians, as an evil figure. It's the God of this world who's not the good God, but there's another God up there in the heavens who's the good God. So he dispensed himself with Old Testament scripture, and he just wanted New Testament. Other Christians at the time were trying to figure out what to do with these texts that were written by Christians, but they also wanted to retain a hold on the Hebrew Bible. So they were slower in the process of creating their own canon. So Marcion comes first, but it's certainly a different canon than the one that the Orthodox Christians came up with. And that is the canon that would have been operative when the Acts of Timothy was written. So all you're getting really in the Acts of Timothy is this slightly different take on exactly how the Gospels were composed, but certainly still we have all 4 of those New Testament Gospels being affirmed as being authoritative here.
I'd like to shift to the infancy Gospel of Thomas for a moment.
Sure.
When do you think that document dates? And can you tell what the point of writing that text was? What kind of attempt was being made there in that story?
The infancy Gospel of Thomas, I think, has tended to be misunderstood or at least maligned a lot in earlier scholarship before I started working on the text. It was usually pulled out by New Testament scholars as a way to show how awful the Apocrypha were. Because here you have these stories of Jesus at various ages between 5 and 12, interacting with his neighbors in Nazareth, sometimes performing good miracles, sometimes performing curses, so hurting people. The best example is Jesus. I think he's 5 years old. He's walking through the marketplace, and another child bumps into his shoulder, and the young Jesus curses him, and the boy falls down dead. And he curses some other people too. So when I started working on this text, I assumed, and I think it's a good assumption, that whoever wrote it thought that the way that Jesus is portrayed here was good. There's nothing wrong with the way Jesus is portrayed. So I had to think, well, what is it that's going on in the text then? Another thing that people talked about with the text is that they said that Jesus gets better as the text progresses. He learns right from wrong. But part of my work in it was trying to reconstruct an earlier, closer to the original form of the text. And that earlier form didn't have some of the later miracles in it where Jesus is performing good acts. So there's really no sense that he really gets better. And I also looked at some comparative literature from the time where, and some studies of that literature that talks about the fact that people in antiquity didn't see character as being changing over time. You have your character from birth. And so whenever you tell stories of illustrious figures like emperors or holy men like Jesus, what they do in their youth is consistent with what they would do as an adult. So try to put all that together, thinking that whoever wrote this text thinks that Jesus as an adult would be just as likely to bless as to curse. And so I tried to think, well, what kind of Jesus do we have here? But if you look at the Gospel of Luke, we don't have so much Jesus cursing stories, but Luke also wrote the book of Acts. And the book of Acts has about 3 or 4 cursing stories where God or some agent of God strikes someone dead or blinds them or something. So I think that the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas would fit into that kind of a context. And I also think that instead of this idea that the text is trying to present Jesus as growing and maturing and becoming less of a curser, more of a blesser, then if that's not the goal of it, what's the goal? And I think the goal of it is that the people around him learn something about him. Because at the beginning of the text, the first several miracles, particularly a couple of the curse miracles, everyone's saying, what kind of child is this? And they're asking his father, Joseph, to teach him to bless and not to curse. But by the end of the text, they're just saying, clearly this child is not human. He's some kind of a god, and we should really, be careful, be reverent of this person. So that's the transformation I saw in the text, this sense of what is this child to, oh my God, this child is something great. And I think that's what's going on in the text. So my goal in writing about this is really trying to get that sense across, that we need to not look at it through 20th century eyes or 21st century eyes, where we don't, the idea that Jesus would curse would be, wrong for many Christians. The idea that character changes over time is the norm. This is not what people in antiquity thought. They thought this text was perfectly fine. And actually, the earliest commentators on the text, they don't take issue with Jesus, what Jesus does in it. What they take issue with is that Jesus is doing any miracles at all when he's a child, because the Gospel of John, which is authoritative by the end of the 2nd century, says Jesus' first miracle, his first sign, is the wedding at Cana, which is when Jesus is an adult. So all of the early commentators on it say, don't read this text because Jesus didn't perform miracles as a child, because his first miracle was at Cana. They don't say, don't read this text because Jesus curses. That doesn't seem to be the thing that bothers them. And we have lots of literature from around the same time of holy figures cursing people. So it's quite a normal thing. The idea being that if you're a holy man, if you're a prophet or whatever, you have this power that you can tap into, and you can use it to bless or to curse. But the whole idea of using it is to show that you have this power, that there's authority, there's divine authority working through you. I'm going on a little bit long here, but the last little bit here, you asked about when this text was written. I think we've mostly settled on the late 2nd century. Irenaeus is aware of a group called the Marcosians, and Irenaeus is writing around 180, and they have this story about Jesus cursing his teacher. What Jesus is learning the ABCs, and he strikes his teacher. And that story is in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So we think Irenaeus is aware of that text, or at least the text is circulating. And that's generally where we date it now, late 2nd century.
And why do you think that text was written? What was the goal of the author at the time?
I think it is there is that sense of filling in. Certainly, you have this space, but I think it is to show again that Jesus, even as a child, that he was mighty. He had divine power coursing through his veins, so to speak. That people around him need to realize who he is, that he's something special, that he's something divine. But always, I think, when you think about it, always think that this is Jesus as an adult portrayed as a child. He's still the same person. So you could tell the same stories as Jesus as an adult as you can as a child. You could tell him also cursing as an adult and eliciting the same kind of response from those around him, which is what the author wants. This sense that Jesus is mighty, divine, has the power of God behind him. I think that's the goal of the text. But it's just kind of fun to do it in a sense as using children instead of adult figures. And you have several characters from Jesus' adult life who are presented there as children. Ananias, for example, who will become the high priest, he is presented in the text as a child. Sorry, he's not presented as a child. He's presented as his younger self when he's just a scribe, and his son is presented there as an antagonist to Jesus. When I was a grad student, I wrote a paper about this text, and one of the things I compared it to was like reading Superboy comics. Superboy is Superman as a child, but all the same things are there, all the same powers are there, the same moral kind of compass is there for Superboy, and he's got the same antagonists, like Lex Luthor is there as a child, and of course other antagonists will show up as well. Same basic dynamics, but children are doing the same things. And I think that's not a bad analogy for the text.
And do you think that the same thing's happening with the multiple different acts that were given, like the acts of Peter, the acts of Andrew, the acts of Thomas, all these different acts, acts of Paul and Thecla, are trying to expand on narratives on certain people they think the acts that the apostles didn't give enough attention or enough information to?
Yeah, well, some people will say that these texts are written in parallel with the Book of Acts, so drawing upon stories that were still circulating around the same time. So think about, say, the Acts of Paul is not necessarily supposed to be a sequel to the Acts, so filling in information from the Acts of Paul, but a parallel account or a second version of that same story. Certainly, they provide more information. Each one of these early apocryphal acts, and there's 5 of them that are the earliest, are they Paul, Peter, Andrew, Thomas, and John, all written late 2nd, early 3rd century. And they tell the types of stories we find in the canonical Book of Acts of apostles going to various places, preaching, doing some healings, converting people, moving on. They all, though, end in martyrdoms. We get to see what happens to the apostles at the end of their lives. John doesn't have a martyrdom. He dies naturally, but the others are martyred. And so we get certainly that continuation. We get to hear something about these characters that we don't hear about in the New Testament the New Testament Book of Acts. All of them are fairly lengthy, about the same length as, say, the Gospel of Matthew. So there's lots of material in there. And 2 other aspects of them which stand out is that the apostles are generally portrayed as ascetics. They sometimes speak against marriage, speak against sex. So it shows us that the group who's creating these certainly has this kind of practice in mind for themselves, which is quite common in early Christianity. It's not all that strange. And the other thing that's really sets them apart is that not only do we have these miracles and healings, but we have long teaching sections. And some of those long teaching sections are not quite what you would call orthodox. But orthodoxy is developing at this time, so people are still trying to figure out what's the right way of thinking about Jesus, what's the wrong way. But these teachings in the Acts have not been the types of teachings that became the standard. They're a little, left of center, you might say, in various ways. So we think that these texts didn't survive very well, because most of them we only have fragments of them. We don't have the complete text, because orthodoxy, as it developed, moved away from the types of things that were in the teachings that the apostles were presenting in these texts. So what they would do is they would take parts of them that they liked, particularly the martyrdoms and the miracle stories, but leave aside the parts they didn't, which are principally the teachings. And then they would rewrite them into new versions. So we have lots of manuscript copies of the later versions, but we have relatively few of the original texts. Again, we have them only in fragments, bits and pieces here and there. So we have to reconstruct them as best we can. And only one of those early 5 do we have the full text of, and that's the Acts of Thomas. All the other ones, we have gaps in the text because we don't have witnesses to them. So a challenging literature to work with because we don't know exactly what they said. But the pieces that we have hint at these groups who were not quite orthodox. They championed asceticism, and they had these particular beliefs that did not win the day, so to speak.
Does any of the New Testament Apocrypha portray Jesus as having been married?
Interesting. Well, one perspective that I and many of my colleagues in our field have about Apocrypha is that it wasn't just written in the first several centuries. It continued after the formation of the canon in the 4th century and continues to today. Because people continue to write texts about Jesus and his contemporaries in order to get ideas across. It's a great way to get ideas across if you place it in the mouth of, say, Jesus or one of the apostles or something. So one of these modern Apocrypha, the most recent apocryphal text, is what's called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And this is about a business card-sized scrap of papyrus with some writing on it, which is fragmentary. It's got some gaps. But at one point, Jesus in it says, "My wife." And then the name Mary comes up a little bit later on. So it's assuming it's Mary who's the wife, and it's assuming it's Mary Magdalene. Now, this text has been found out to be a modern forgery, and it basically takes some stuff from the Gospel of Thomas and rewrites it and tries to make Jesus into a Mary Magdalene into a married couple. Chances are the person who created this was trying to do it for money, so not for a pious reason. But it still is a modern apocryphal text. It deals with a modern issue because there is this interest these days, thanks to the Da Vinci Code and other texts, movies, etc., about the idea that Jesus was married. So it captures something about today, and every apocryphal text does that throughout time. They use characters to deal with something in their own day. But are there any ancient texts in which Jesus is married? No, but there are some kind of interesting hints at relationship with Mary Magdalene. So, for example, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, mention is made that Jesus loved her more than any other apostle or follower of Jesus. So she's elevated above the others as more beloved, but it doesn't mean they were married. Then we have the Gospel of Philip, which has some hints there too. And we have this section where it talks again about Mary Magdalene being more loved than anybody else, and that Jesus would kiss her often on and then there's a gap in the manuscript. I'm not sure what that would be. And a term is used for Mary Magdalene as the companion of Jesus. Famously in the Da Vinci Code, a character in that text says companion in that time means wife. But that's not the case. That term can mean several things, not just wife. Now, I'm skeptical that is the intent of these authors to say that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene or was intimate with Mary Magdalene. But it does certainly place her on a level around the same level of the apostles, which in antiquity would have been scandalous to some people today. So certainly she's given a primacy of place in these texts. We even have a gospel in her name. But she's not presented as being married or intimate with Jesus in these texts. There's certain, ambiguities to the text. It certainly invites some speculation in that regard, but nowhere is it unequivocally stated that that's the case.
Is 3 Corinthians an anti-Marcionite text? If so, was it written to backdate anti-Marcionite ideas to Paul? Or if not, why was 3 Corinthians forged?
All right, so 3 Corinthians. A better term for that would be the Corinthian correspondence, in a sense, because we have a letter from the Corinthians and then Paul's response. And in the letter to Paul, we are told that Simon Magus and Corinthus, who is apparently a contemporary of John, the Apostle John, have come to Corinth, and they are teaching certain things. And so they're teaching like not to listen or not to read the Hebrew prophets, that God is not the Almighty, so the God of this world is not the God, that there's no resurrection of the flesh, humans are not God's creation, again, created of the lower God of this world. Jesus did not come in the flesh, he was not born of Mary, and the world was created by angels, not by God. And then, so they're asking Paul in this letter, what do you think of these ideas? And Paul, in the letter, which we call 3 Corinthians, basically just dismantles all of those points of view. So certainly we have a letter here from Paul, intended to presented that way, affirming what would be considered orthodox belief, that God is the only God, he's the God of this world, Jesus came from in the flesh, etc., etc. Now, what is he actually combating? Now, if the letter said Marcion has come to town and has these beliefs, what do you think? That would be anachronistic, because Marcion lived about almost 100 years after Paul did. So sometimes we have in some Christian texts, we have some other characters who share similar beliefs, Gnostic-like beliefs, like Marcion did, who represent Marcion. There's a text called the Pseudo-Clementine Romance, in which Peter does these debates with Simon Magus. But most of what is the content of Simon Magus's beliefs are basically Marcionism. So he becomes kind of a stand-in for Marcionism, but fits the time period because he was a contemporary of the apostles. So we might have something similar here, that the views of Simon and Corinthus here are really the views of Marcion, but they stand in for him, and Paul gets to kind of combat them here. And I think that's a good argument that's what's going on, that these ideas are Marcionite, or certainly Marcionite adjacent. They have some of the similar elements to it. So here we get some. You have to think of Paul too as a character, a figure that many early Christians valued. The Marcionites really liked him, but Orthodox really liked him as well, and some other groups as well. So if you want to pull Paul into your orbit, or bring him closer to you and away from others, then you have him affirm your beliefs. You have him as a spokesperson for your beliefs. So here, an Orthodox writer, it's Acts of Paul. I know it's not canonical, but it's the point of view of the text is still Orthodox. An Orthodox writer puts Orthodox ideas in the mouth of Paul, which are contrary to Marcionite and Gnostic beliefs. You could see a Marcionite doing something similar, right? We don't have, unfortunately, many witnesses to Marcionite beliefs, because the winners we always have the text of the winners in these debates. We don't have the text of, unfortunately, the losers. So we have the Orthodox response here to Marcionism, or something similar to it, in this text. And I think that's really what's going on here. It's about trying to rescue Paul from Marcionitism, or pull him closer to your orbit, away from Marcionism. And we see that done with other characters as well, like Peter and others. It's a quite common phenomenon.
When was the Toldeth Yeshu written? In a different version of the Toldeth Yeshu, it claims that Jesus appeared before Queen Helena and King Jannaeus, but in another text it says it was before Pilate. What do you think is causing that disagreement to exist between the two different versions?
Well, the Toldeth Yeshua, just to make sure it's clear what it is, this is what usually referred to as an anti-gospel. So it's a story of Jesus' life, but it's told by Jewish writers, trying to basically scandalize Jesus. They're in a position, they're a more marginalized group as Christianity starts to gain power in basically the medieval world. And so this is a way of kind of fighting back against the man, so to speak, as you create a text in which their cherished figure is slandered. So it doesn't present Jesus in a very positive way. Now, it's debated about how old this text is. Most of our witnesses to it are late 16th, 17th century, though there are some Aramaic fragments that go back to around the 11th century, and we did a translation of some of that in there. Again, the More New Testament Apocrypha, Volume 1. So those Aramaic fragments bring us closer to the time of the text. They can only take us so far. 11th century is not very early. Scholars vary on exactly when to date it, but some say 5th century, 3rd or 4th century, maybe a little bit later than that. We don't really know. And part of the reason we don't really know is this text is so fluid. We have so many versions of it. And there are three main groups, and they are what we call the Herod group, the Helen group, and the Pilate group. And these three groups represent figures who are given prominence in them. So you mentioned Pilate, I think, and Helen. Now, why do we have these variations in it? Well, often we find in apocryphal texts, whether they're Christian or not Christian, this is anti-Christian, certain fluidity, because there doesn't get the sense of an authoritative version, because it's not scripture, right? There's this tendency when you're creating scripture and a canon of scripture to find an authoritative text, and from there on, it varies little in its transmission. Not that it doesn't vary at all. We have thousands of manuscripts in the New Testament with variations among them, but Apocrypha vary much more. So you have lots and lots of different versions, expansions, reductions, additions, etc. So with the Toldoth Yeshua, we're getting something similar. We're getting these variations. Now, I guess what I would want to do as a scholar of this text is try to figure out which of these versions is the earliest, and that can be a difficult thing to do. So I'm not sure where the scholarship is on that exactly, about which version is earlier than the other, but certainly with the mention of Helen and Alexander Janaeus, we have some anachronistic details there. Alexander Janaeus is a 1st century BCE Hasmonean Jewish king. And Helen seems to be a composite of his wife and the mother of Constantine the Great. So there's certainly something really garbled there. Whereas Pilate and Herod, as your markers for chronology, are more accurate. So does this mean someone has cleaned up the text and made it more accurate based on having more knowledge of the New Testament Gospels? Or has someone somehow screwed it up and brought into the text some anachronisms? Chances are it goes the other way around. We tend to think of the more difficult readings being the earliest ones, with the sense that people would fix errors rather than introduce errors. So maybe this version with Helen and Alexander Janaeus is the earliest one of them all. But it's not a text I've worked on in any great capacity, so I don't know where the thinking is of that. I know the major work on that now that's been released is trying to understand the text in all its forms. So we have what you would call a synopsis. So we see all of the versions of the text before us as a really good, useful tool to see the text in its various forms. And so maybe the goal in general of a study of a text like this is not to figure out what the earliest form is, but just to try to figure out where each form is placed in history and how it connects to particular time periods and even sometimes geographical areas. So I'm not sure if there's been any equivocal kind of a statement about which one is earlier, but I think it is still of interest to be able to look at all of these versions and see what each of them are doing with the characters and the chronology.
Is there any New Testament Apocrypha that we have where there is some controversy? Meaning, is there any text it's not so clear if it's late or it could be early and it could provide some good information that most of the New Testament Apocrypha does not provide?
The best one in that regard is the Gospel of Thomas. There's debate about whether it's early or not. But there are a few reasons why, good reasons why I think that this text is an early text. For one, the manuscript evidence is early. We have 3 fragments from Oxyrhynchus in Egypt that are 2nd or 3rd century. So that's quite early. If we imagine that a scrap of text is within 100 or 200 years of its time of composition, because it's unlikely to be the autograph copy written by the person who wrote it, right? Then this is potentially a 1st century text. Another reason to think about it being early is it's the form of the text. It's just sayings of Jesus, usually numbered as 114 separate sayings, very, very little narrative. And scholars of the Bible, of the New Testament Gospels, used to imagine that as material about Jesus was communicated orally over time, sayings were the material rather than narratives that would have retained their integrity better than the stories would. So they get passed down easier, often because there's certain poetic elements to it, certain balance, so it makes it easier to remember them and apply them. And the big theory about the composition of the Synoptic Gospels is that Matthew and Luke drew on the Gospel of Mark, on the one hand, for its narrative, and something else that we no longer have for its narratives, for its sayings, and scholars call this hypothetical source Q. So if Q existed, if it truly was the saying source, and it predated the New Testament Gospels, here we have the Gospel of Thomas in the same literary form, a bunch of sayings, that is very similar to that. It's not the same materials. There's a bit of overlap, but not the same materials. So think of it as, if we're thinking about genres as having a certain chronology in history, then sayings Gospels may predate narrative Gospels. So we have, again, a Gospel of Thomas that could be an early text for that reason as well. And then when you look at the individual stories in it that have parallels sayings in it that have parallels in the New Testament Gospels, many scholars say that the versions that we find in the Gospel of Thomas are earlier in form than the New Testament versions. And by earlier in form, I mean basically, so in the New Testament, you might have this parable of Jesus, where Jesus tells the parable and then gives an interpretation. Well, the version that we find of the same parable in the Gospel of Thomas doesn't have the interpretation in it. So it suggests to us that the Gospel of Thomas's version is earlier because it doesn't get this expansion, this interpretation to it. So 3 or 4 reasons there to think that it might be an early text. Scholars who don't think it's an early text see it as kind of a greatest hits collection. We have a bunch of stuff from the New Testament Gospels put together with a bunch of stuff that's not in the New Testament Gospels, and then it becomes its own text by a Gnostic group of the 2nd century. I'm not inclined to believe that, but there is a middle ground. As I've said before, these apocryphal texts tend to change over time, get expanded and reduced and changed in various ways. What we might have in the Gospel of Thomas is an early kernel, like a certain cluster of sayings that are early, and then stuff gets added to it over time. We see this kind of thing happen in our text. It's not strange. So maybe the elements in it that look early are early, and elements in it that seem a bit later, that people who think it's late would argue are later. It's like Gnostic ideas, which tend to come later, by the 2nd century. These are added to the text at a later time. So that means the text can be both early and late, too. But getting back to your original question, is there something in there that goes back to Jesus? Well, it's interesting enough that there are parallels with the New Testament Gospels. And maybe those parallels give us a window into an earlier form of those particular stories or sayings. Sayings, I should say, not stories. But what about the stuff that's not in the New Testament Gospels? These sayings that show up there. Could some of those be authentic, that Jesus actually said those? And many scholars would say, yes, there's actually some of those sayings that are only in the Gospel of Thomas could be things said by Jesus that have been passed down orally and in written form alongside the New Testament Gospels. Famously, the Gospel of John says, I'm paraphrasing, not everything in this text is everything Jesus did. There aren't enough books in the world to hold everything that Jesus said and did. And that certainly must be true in the sense that Jesus did and said many things, and the Gospels in the New Testament are only so long. So there would have been other things, really, that would have been passed along as well. Maybe some of those things ended up in the Gospel of Thomas. It's certainly the text that is the best claim to have some of that material in it. So many scholars today who work on the historical Jesus, try to reconstruct his teachings, will use the Gospel of Thomas as one of those sources. There's a few other bits and pieces too of sayings that show up in some other texts, in the apocryphal texts, but the Gospel of Thomas is our chief resource there.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Tony.
Oh, we're all done. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jacob. of course.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.